We're almost finished, and you may be tempted to skip over this class because only a few simple, easy to figure out where they go parts are left. Hang in there with me for a little while longer, especially for the last few minutes, because I'll show you how to install the torque converter and I'll explain the fluid fill procedure. I'm glad to see you back for the last session. This is Ford E4OD 4R100 class, lesson 16. Before we get back to work, I want to say it's been my pleasure sharing with you what I know about this fascinating machine. I've always enjoyed working on transmissions, and I hope you will too. I wanted to not only show you how to work on them, but also inspire you to as well. If I can fix these things, so can you. The goals for this lesson are, first of all, to finish the valve body area by installing the filter and pan. Next, we'll work on the extension housing and attach it to the case. After that, we'll install the cooling bypass tube and a few other small parts. Finally, I'll discuss two things you don't want to miss: how to put the torque converter in and how to put the fluid in. In the last lesson, we installed the main valve body. There is one more part to install before replacing the bottom pan: the filter. The correct filter for the transmission is determined by the pan depth. There are two types of the filter. One is for the earlier shallow two-wheel drive pan, and the other is for the deeper four-wheel drive pan. Keep in mind, all 4R100 transmissions have a deep pan, like this one, and we'll use a four-wheel drive type filter even if the vehicle is a two-wheel drive version. The filter I removed and placed here during the disassembly is actually a brand new four-wheel drive type. Let's compare it to the two-wheel drive type. They are dimensionally the same except for the sump tube length. The four-wheel drive type has a 1-inch longer tube. Put fluid onto the pump inlet bore. And the ribbed filter seal. Press it into place. The overhaul package comes with a cork-type pan gasket, but if the model you are working on came with a reusable steel-backed rubber type, like this one, clean and reuse it. Get the pan. "20 bolts fasten the pan to the case. torque the pan bolts to 10 foot-pounds, 120 inch-pounds, or 15 Newton meters. Get the bell housing plug. It goes here. Take the extension housing to another work area. The rear bushing and seal for the drive shaft yoke should always be replaced. Use a large screwdriver and hammer to collapse the metal clad of the seal. Use the screwdriver or a punch to drive the old bushing out. Get the new bushing from the kit. If it has this hole, align it with the slot in the housing. Drive it in with a large socket, valve, or bushing driver. Get the new seal. Drive it in. we'll need the gasket which goes between the case and housing. I've repositioned the transmission upright. Set the gasket like so. Nine bolts fasten the extension housing to the case. The only bolt with a stud goes here where we made a mark during teardown. Two of them are 1/4 of an inch shorter than the others. They go here and here. The next part to reinstall is the cooler bypass tube. If you'll recall, an O-ring goes here in the case. A new one is in a sub-kit. There are 4 new sealing washers for the 2 hollow bolts in the overhaul package. Here they are in a sub-kit. Replace the washers like so and install the tube onto the case. Tighten the bolts to 15 foot-pounds, 180 inch-pounds, or 28 Newton meters. Get the manual lever position sensor, which is also known as the MLPS. We'll also need the two 8mm bolts which fasten it. Place it over the manual lever shaft. Install the bolts loosely. Move the lever to the neutral position. Align the mark on the sensor body with the one on the center part. Snug the bolts. Depending upon which model you may be working on, a block-off plug or turbine shaft speed sensor goes here. Our demo model simply had a plug. Get it and the 8mm bolt which fastens it. Install a new O-ring from the miscellaneous subkit. Snug the bolt. There is one more very important part left to install on the case: the vent hose. In the event of fluid venting from the case, the liquid would be directed toward the ground and not onto a hot exhaust pipe or catalytic converter where it could ignite. Even though the transmission itself is finished, we still need to discuss and install the large assembly which drives it, the torque converter. A high-quality remanufactured torque converter has new internal parts and hub. It's also pre-lubed with a small amount of transmission fluid in order to prevent damage when the engine is started for the first time. It is extremely important to install the converter completely into the transmission before they are installed together as an assembly onto the back of the engine. This is how they should appear ready to install. Let's take a closer look at how to do this. Begin installation by supporting the converter from underneath as you gently insert the hub through the front seal and into the bushing. Continue to support it from below while pushing it in as you rotate it back and forth. You may or may not be able to actually feel the separate engagements as the splines of the input shaft and stator support, as well as the flats of the hub, engage. Measuring the distance from the bolt pads to the front of the bell housing will give you a rough but not necessarily final positive indication the converter is in all of the way. I measure about 1 1/8 of an inch, which is about right for a 4R100 paired to a gasoline engine. The converter you see here is actually fully installed, but there is a better, foolproof method to determine if the torque converter is installed completely. After attaching the transmission to the engine, check to make sure a gap is present between the flex plate and flex plate to converter bolt pads. The gap is usually about 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch. Another way to say this is, after bolting the transmission to the engine, the torque converter bolt pads should not be crushed up against the flex plate. If they are, something is seriously wrong. The most likely reason is the end of the torque converter hub has not completely engaged with the flat areas of the inner pump rotor. Here's another view to demonstrate this. The flat part of the hub must index with the flats inside of the inner pump rotor. This is actually a C6 inner rotor, but the concept is the same. If it isn't in all the way, the rotor will be crushed against the rear of the rotor cavity. It would chew into the stator half and the pump would be ruined if you were to attempt to start the engine in this situation. If you have to, remove the transmission from the engine and make another attempt to fully install the converter. Once again, rotate the converter while pushing in on it until it finally moves further into the pump. As I mentioned in the beginning, I also want to explain how to put fluid into the transmission. Here's the procedure for refilling a dry E4OD or 4R100 transmission and remanufactured torque converter. In other words, no fluid has been added to the transmission or torque converter prior to installation into the vehicle. It's not necessary to do this. The transmission and converter are pre-lubed and will not be harmed during the initial startup of the engine. After transmission installation, make sure to set the vehicle parking brake and place the selector lever into the park position. Do not start the engine yet and pour 4 quarts of Dextron Mercon type automatic transmission fluid into the transmission through the dipstick tube. Start the engine and immediately add another 10 quarts of fluid. Apply the brakes with the brake pedal and shift the transmission from park to reverse and then to drive in order to circulate fluid into the various piston cavities. You should be able to feel some engagement at this point. Put the selector lever back into the park position. Check the fluid level with the dipstick several times until you get a stable reading. Add more fluid and continue to check the fluid level with the stick until it reaches the full mark. This transmission requires 16 quarts of fluid or more, depending